Good evening, and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Wesley Whitaker, and I'm one of your Ath Fellows this year. Last week in Johannesburg, Vicky Momberg was sentenced to 3 years in prison after cell phone video captured her repeatedly yelling a racist slur at black police officers. She is the first South African to be imprisoned after a 2016 law that imposed criminal penalties for speech that advocates hatred, incites violence, or causes contempt or ridicule. The decision was met mostly with celebration on social media in a majority black country where profound inequality exists, with memories of an apartheid system that institutionalized racial separation and oppression. But others have argued that criminalizing hate speech has a chilling effect on freedom of expression and facilitates the silencing of minority viewpoints. In the United States, the First Amendment protects almost all expression, no matter how offensive, making social pressure and disapprobation the only means of penalizing offensive speech. Sometimes, however, free speech events have devolved into violent clashes between groups, including on the campus of UC Berkeley and in Charlottesville, Virginia last year. What should be done about speech that incites hatred against persons based on traits that are beyond their control? Our speaker tonight will argue that despite its potential harm, hate speech should be protected under an expansive approach to the First Amendment, and that we should promote equality and social harmony through vibrant counterspeech. Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. She has written, taught, and advocated extensively in the areas of constitutional law and civil liberties, including through frequent media interviews. From 1991 to 2008, she served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first woman to lead the nation's largest and oldest civil liberties organization. Strossen is currently a member of ACLU's National Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and Heterodox Academy. When she stepped down as ACLU president in 2008, Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and David Souter participated in her farewell tribute luncheon. Strossen is also a prolific author. Her latest book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, will be officially published on May 1st. And her first two books are Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights, and Speaking of Race, Speaking of Sex, Hate Speech, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. She received her bachelor's from Harvard College and her JD from Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor for the Harvard Law Review. Professor Strassen's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the Rose Institute of State and Local Government. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time, and please join me in welcoming Professor Strossen to the Athenaeum.
Thank you so much, Wesley, for that cordial introduction, and thanks to the audience for the warm welcome. It is such an honor to participate in such an impressive program, and I would like to thank the people with whom I worked the most closely in preparing and arranging it, Bipasha Nadon and Marionette Moore. I also have to convey particular gratitude for your putting me up in a hotel that was right across the street from 21 Choices. I look forward to exploring all 21, so I hope you'll have me back in the future. So I want to also congratulate your college for a wonderful honor that is directly relevant to the topic of my book and my presentation tonight, namely that FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, on whose advisory board I serve, gave you the green light rating for respecting freedom of speech. It is a very rare rating. Unfortunately, you are the first California college to have, and the only one to have earned that rating, and you are in a select group of only 38 higher educational institutions in the country to have done so. So many congratulations, and I firmly believe that that robust protection of freedom of speech, even for the thought that we hate and that we consider hateful, to quote Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, is absolutely essential for other values that we all hold dear, including equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, and societal harmony. So that is the nutshell summary of the arguments that I make in my book. That we do not have to choose, and we should not choose, between what are sometimes called civil rights and civil liberties. We do not have to choose, and we should not choose, between liberty and equality, that all of these values are mutually reinforcing and essential for each other. Now, I know that there has been pushback on many college campuses against these ideas. There has been pushback in your community, among others. Students' public opinion surveys show that a majority of students on campuses, not a large majority, but a notable majority, believe that hate speech, and I'll tell you in a moment why I'm putting that in air quotes, hate speech that is offensive or insulting on the basis of identity, a majority of students believe that that should not be constitutionally protected. Indeed, a majority of students think that any speech that makes somebody uncomfortable or that is perceived by somebody as unwelcome should not be protected. And in pushing back against that notion, I want to start by quoting somebody who has long been a hero of mine, a distinguished educator, a pioneer as an African American woman. I'm speaking about Ruth Simmons, who was the president of Brown University starting, I believe, in 2001 to about 2009. She was the first African American president of any Ivy League university and the first female president of Brown University. And that far back, she kind of presciently made a comment. I say presciently because it was before we started hearing the concept that we hear so often now, that students should not have to deal with ideas or expression that makes them uncomfortable. In her very first convocation address as president at Brown, she said, "I believe that education at its best is the antithesis of comfort." Think about that. Education at its best is the antithesis of comfort. And she went on to say, so if you come here seeking comfort, then go through yon iron gate. But if you want to stay and develop the abilities to advocate for justice in this community and beyond, then stay and learn to grapple with the uncomfortable ideas. In fact, one of the, and here I'm thinking of Professor Jonathan Shields on your faculty, whose work I have so admired. He wrote recently an op-ed in the New York Times in which, I assume you've all read it, but let me refresh your recollections, when he said he doesn't like to identify people in terms of who they are, what demographic categories society may put us into. But sometimes we have to recognize the reality that depending who you are, you may well have more credibility, at least with certain audiences. And I do recognize that as a white woman with a very privileged education, I came from humble background economically, but that I don't necessarily have the credibility that I might have as a member of, I will say that I am a Jew, and my father was a concentration camp survivor, but I am white, and I think it was very important throughout my book to quote African Americans and members of other minority groups who have been full-time engaged in the civil rights struggle, resisting, suppressing hateful ideas and hate speech. I've already quoted Ruth Simmons. Let me go on to refer to the great Dr. Martin Luther King. Just one day after the very, very sad 50th anniversary of his assassination, which is seared in my memory from the time I was about the age of some of the college students here tonight. Although what a tragic, irreparable loss, his words are immortal, his teachings are immortal, and he spoke so powerfully and so eloquently on these themes. And one of many, I'll just share with you a couple of them, which you may have heard before, but I think we can never hear too often. He said, "Darkness can never banish darkness, only light can do that. Hate can never banish hate, only love can do that." And in that spirit of advocating love and understanding and education and advocacy and what we lawyers call counterspeech, raising our voices with a different message, to disagree, to rebut, to refute, to support those who are disparaged. Dr. King made a statement that is one of the epigraphs. I have 3 at the beginning of my book. And his was, in the end, what we will remember is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So, you know, I'll tell you a little bit about the title of the book, because it is this very, very briefest summary of the message. Hate, all in large caps there, is a very serious problem in this society. We see rising incidents of hateful speech and even hate crimes, crimes that are motivated by discrimination against the crime victim. And the subtitle is, and interestingly enough, the book designer, I know those of you in the back probably can't see it, but you might be able to see that the font that the book cover designer chose for the subtitle is deliberately the font that is used in the US Constitution. Why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. I gave a talk a couple of days ago at the University of Washington, and interestingly enough, they took the words in the title and they rearranged them slightly in a way that I think underscores the message, which is resisting hate through free speech, not censorship. So my message is very much that we have an obligation to effectively counter hatred, hateful attitudes, hateful speech, and hateful and violent conduct. But we can only effectively do that through free speech and not through censorship. Okay, so I want to tell you why I decided to write this book and what I learned from doing it, having been an advocate forever on these issues. But I said I was going to say a little bit more about who I am, because I agree with John Shields that for better or worse, in a society that is very conscious of our identities and our demographic background, I think we should all be judged by the quality of our ideas, but realistically, we're also judged by who we are and what our background is. So as I mentioned, my father is a Holocaust survivor. He was born a so-called half-Jew. See, this is part of why I don't like identity politics, because I associate it with Hitler's Nuremberg laws, which had very precise, intricate definitions of who counted as a Jew and a half-Jew, and it's a very chilling experience to go to. There's a museum in Germany at the Weimar Conference Center, which is where the Nuremberg laws were adopted, and I could see exactly what the factors were that made my father fit into that category, which resulted in his being imprisoned at the Buchenwald forced labor camp. He was not slated for murder, fortunately, but he was enslaved. I'm the daughter of somebody who was enslaved. He was also scheduled to be sterilized by the Nazis literally one day after he ended up being liberated by the American military. So I literally owe my life to the American military, as I'm fond of telling military audiences when I speak to them, as I often do. So let me assure you, and I have many more distant relatives, and my husband's family as well happened, both his father and his mother independently were Holocaust survivors who had most of their family exterminated. So I will tell you something that was also said by R.A. Nair, who is the executive director of the ACLU, when we handled the most famous, some would say most infamous case defending freedom of speech, even for hate mongers, namely neo-Nazis who were seeking to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois, a town with a large Jewish population, many of whom were Holocaust survivors. And the ACLU came to the defense of their free speech rights, and that was so controversial even among many ACLU members who are the most stalwart defenders of free speech that we lost 15% of our members. Now, we won that case clearly in the courts of law. It was completely consistent with the bedrock principles of freedom of speech, which I already mentioned, freedom even for the idea that we loathe. But R.A. Nair, who led the ACLU through that turbulent time, has said something that I completely agree with. He was himself a Holocaust survivor. He escaped as a child from Germany with his immediate family, but the rest of his extended family was assassinated by the Nazis. And he said, and I echo, much as I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech. So if I were convinced that censoring hate speech would have stopped the Nazis from rising to power, would have stopped or curtailed genocide and the Holocaust, I would be all in favor of that censorship. I completely agree with that. So I want you to know that my argument against censorship is at least twofold, two major points here. One is what is the more familiar expected position, that is inconsistent with fundamental constitutional principles, freedom of speech and equality and due process. I'm going to elaborate on all of these in a moment. But even assuming for the sake of argument that we were not concerned about those principles, there is what we lawyers would call an independently sufficient justification for opposing censorship, and that is that it is ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. Now, one more personal note. Although I do consider myself to be a person of privilege, I'm very grateful to this country and my college education and my parents for giving me the education that I think is the major reason why I feel to be so privileged. And all of you are blessed with a wonderful education here as well. But nonetheless, I have been subject to hate speech, very vicious anti-Semitic speech, and very vicious misogynistic speech. So although to a lesser extent than many other people in this society who I know encounter that kind of speech much more often, I do empathize because I do remember, and I recount this in my book, shockingly, I was fairly old before I was subject to my first face-to-face vicious anti-Semitic epithet. I had already graduated from Harvard Law School. I was already practicing as a lawyer in a major Wall Street firm, and even so, I was so shocked and so traumatized and so stunned that I was rendered speechless. So I really understand when people say that there is this terrible power that those kinds of words can have in certain contexts, power that has a negative impact on free speech too, right? Not only equality and dignity and other such values, but it even results in chilling, or can result in chilling, the speech of the person at whom it is targeted. So in that sense, we have speech on both sides. And I assure you that despite having that experience and that empathy, I still come to the very strong conclusion that I do. Now, let me tell you why I wrote the book. I had been advocating the classic ACLU position on this issue ever since I graduated from law school, when the ACLU was handling the Skokie case. At that time, I was absolutely convinced that we could not have meaningful equality, meaningful human rights advocacy in this country without a sufficiently robust freedom of speech, that it would extend to hate speech. And one of the reasons I had that conclusion goes back to Dr. King and the civil rights movement. Every single advocate for racial justice throughout this country's history, not only Dr. King, but W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionists, those who fought Jim Crow, and so forth, they have all been crusaders for freedom of speech. Why? Because censorship has consistently been used to suppress the voices disproportionately of those who are challenging the status quo, including those who advocated for racial justice. When I said every single advocate for racial justice has been in that camp, I somewhat overstated it, and I apologize, because some of them initially did support censoring hate speech, but changed their position. So during the 1960s civil rights movement, initially, somewhat earlier, both the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, early in the 20th century, and the American Jewish Congress earlier in the 20th century, both of those organizations which were advocating racial justice and anti-discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and so forth, both of them had initially supported hate speech laws, but as a result of seeing how those laws were enforced, namely to silence their voices, they changed their position. So I had been advocating that position forever, and I frankly reached a point where I thought I had nothing new to say. I had no new arguments were being made either on my side or on the other side, and I gracefully withdrew from the fray. I kept giving speeches, but I stopped writing. And then a couple of years ago, something happened on college campuses that was a mixed blessing from my perspective. Having been what's now called a social justice warrior on campus in the 60s and 70s, I was just thrilled at the resurgence of student activism all over the country in support of racial justice, against sexual violence, in favor of immigrants' rights, and so forth. We had not, against the injustices in the so-called criminal justice system. This was a thrill after decades of college students being rather apathetic and not even interested in following what's happening politically, let alone in engaging and changing the course of politics. So all of that was absolutely thrilling. But starting a couple of years ago, it began to become clear, both through highly publicized specific incidents of speech suppression and through public opinion surveys showing that the majority of students think that offensive or hateful speech should be suppressed in support of furthering their social justice causes. I realized that all of those arguments that I had been making for so many years clearly had not been persuasive enough. And I love nothing like a challenge. I'm a natural advocate and educator. Those are my two hats that I enjoy wearing in life. And so I really welcomed the challenge of trying to make the case even more persuasively. As I said to students who interviewed me this afternoon, by the way, both my table conversation and my interview with a student journal here, I'm so impressed by the caliber of the students and their thoughtfulness, the insight, the articulateness, the challenge. They have no fear in asking questions, and that's exactly what I welcomed. But as I said to those students this afternoon, I believe that I approached the topic with an open mind, willing to re-examine my tried and true principles, to look at new evidence, to look at new arguments. As a result of doing so, however, I became much more convinced than ever, number one, of the wisdom of U.S. legal principles, including First Amendment principles, but also equal protection principles. I think those principles are not nearly as well understood as they should be. That's an understatement. They are badly misunderstood, even by people who should know better, including so-called thought leaders. And I do think that even just understanding what our law actually does and the line that it draws between speech that is hate speech that is protected and hate speech that is unprotected, I believe would go a long distance toward making more people much more supportive of our law. The second thing that I learned was that in the intervening decades, since the Skokie case, many other countries, all European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, so forth, South Africa has been mentioned, basically all developed democracies, as well as other countries, have actual experience with enforcing hate speech laws, and that record is deplorable. Whatever we might aspire to in terms of thinking that certain ideas that we think are hateful and should be suppressed, that is not how these laws have operated. And I was really struck by the large number of human rights activists and lawyers in many other countries and at the United Nations and many other international organizations have become so critical of their country's hate speech laws based on how they actually work in operation, and have urged moving more in the direction of the United States, relying on civil society and societal pressure and counterspeech and laws that actually outlaw discrimination and discriminatory violence as much more effective than suppressing hate speech. So that was a very important insight that I got from this research. And finally, all of the study and reflection reinforced my conclusion that for multiple independently sufficient grounds, we should continue to do what we have been doing, which is not only refusing to censor hate speech, but also, and I have to say this is a difference over the last several decades, that we have an increasing reliance on counterspeech. When I went back and looked at the initial articles that were published by law professors in the United States, starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a number of pioneering law professors advocated so-called hate speech codes on college campuses. And I disagree with their prescription for the problem that we should enact hate speech codes, but I sincerely thank and acknowledge them in my book because they really were on the forefront of pointing out the significant harms that can be done, not necessarily, but can be done through hate speech. But what was so interesting to me was reading their articles, every single one of them stressed that a major reason for the psychic and speech chilling and other disempowering impacts of hateful speech on campus was not so much the hateful speech itself, but what they said was the complete silence on the part of the surrounding community. And that really astonished me because we've now become so used to something that apparently had not existed several decades ago, and that is when hateful speech occurs, there is such a strong pushback. Everybody from the university president to student government leaders to other students on campus to the people who are disparaged themselves and groups that represent them. This is a very positive and very exciting development. Of course, I wish that there was no need for the counter speech, but I'm thrilled at the fact, especially that what we've seen is minority students feeling that they have the self-confidence and the dignity to speak back and to not allow somebody who is using hateful language against them to disparage them. There's a professor named Shawn Harper who has a center on racial equity on campus. I can't remember the exact complicated name. He was originally based at the University of Pennsylvania, and he recently relocated it to a college in California. I know, that's not very specific. How can I say that here? He moved after I wrote the book. But his center has repeatedly been called into various campuses around the country where there are racial tensions to assess the racial climate. And interestingly enough, he said, number one, that the minority students have become unmuted. I love that term, unmuted. That despite, or maybe because of, the publicity about the hateful rhetoric that is being used by some politicians and others, and repeated hate crimes that are being publicized, that could have a chilling, disempowering impact, but that these students in very large numbers are responding in another way, speaking up, arguing back, standing up for themselves, defending their dignity. And that is just a wonderful, wonderful development. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of the various points that support my bottom line conclusion. In whatever time I have remaining, I want to expand a little bit, as much as I can, but without cutting into the audience time for questions and answers, which is the most important part of the evening. Let me start with the U.S. law. I told you that there is such ignorance in what people say about the law. The ignorance runs and the misstatements run in two directions. On the one hand, we have too many politicians and others say hate speech is not free speech. In other words, arguing that hate speech, whatever that is absolutely unprotected. For example, after Ann Coulter was denied a platform at Berkeley last year, that exact statement was made by Howard Dean, who was the former chair of the Democratic National Committee, governor of Vermont, a serious presidential contender. Hate speech is not free speech. Berkeley did not violate her First Amendment rights, and others have said the same thing. Conversely, too often there are at least suggestions, if not outright statements, that hate speech is absolutely protected. And here I plead a little bit guilty, because in the past I've allowed myself to participate in debates such as should hate speech be protected? And that at least implicitly suggests that it is categorically protected. In fact, the brilliance of U.S. law, which I really became much more familiar with and respectful of as a result of writing this book, is that it is much more nuanced, and it does draw a very sensible line between the hate speech that is not protected and the hate speech that is protected. So I promised I would explain why the air quotes, and that's where this is the appropriate timing to do that. There is no constitutional law or legal term of art hate speech. The U.S. Supreme Court has never defined and identified a category of speech based on its hateful or hated conduct and said that's excluded from First Amendment protection. So in contrast to the best example where it has done that, you've all heard of it, is obscenity, which is a legal term of art, which the Supreme Court has attached to a certain defined category of sexually explicit speech based on its content, and the Supreme Court has said that is absolutely unprotected, excluded from the First Amendment. It's never done that with hate speech. To the contrary, and the way we usually use that term is to refer to speech that conveys hateful or discriminatory ideas on the basis of who you are, right? That said, keep your antenna up for it. You will see that people tend to use the term hate speech much more expansively than that in practice, to use it to describe and to disparage whatever speech they hate, right? So even today I was reading an article that used the term hate speech to refer to fake news, because that is a type of message that was hated. But I'll use it in the core sense in which it's used it tends to be used in everyday speech. And here the Supreme Court completely completely across the ideological spectrum, consistently says, hateful speech, no matter how hated it is constitutionally protected. It did that most recently, just this past summer, one of its most recent rulings in a case called Matal versus Tam, which illustrates why protecting hate speech is consistent with not only First Amendment freedom of speech principles, but also equality principles. Some of you may be familiar with the case, but for those who are not, Simon Tam is an Asian American rock musician who formed a band with other Asian, and I'm hearing some people say the Slants, right? With other Asian American young men, and they chose the name the Slants. Of course it's an ethnic slur that has been used to disparage and dehumanize and degrade Asian Americans. That is not why they chose the name. To the contrary, they wanted to take the stigma out of that term, to reappropriate it and assert their pride as Asian Americans. Well, guess what? It turns out there was an anti-hate speech law in the U.S. Trademark law that basically said the government will not allow you to get trademark or trade name protection for a word that is disparaging or demeaning, including on the basis of personal characteristics. So in other words, our government was depriving Simon Tam and his band not only of their free speech rights, but also of their equality rights and their right to choose how to reassert and reaffirm their dignity, to reclaim a term that had been oppressive and to turn it against the would-be oppressors. Now, in contrast, so number one lesson is the mere fact that the message is discriminatory, hateful, and hated is never a basis for censorship. However, if the hateful message, or for that matter, any other message, in a particular context, in other words, we're getting beyond just the content of the speech, and in a particular context, directly causes specific, imminent, serious harm, then it may be punished under existing law. And the Supreme Court has basically carved out and defined a number of types of expression that satisfy this general concept, and which I call satisfying the emergency principle. If the speech causes an emergency, right, that cannot be averted through any measure short of checking the speech itself. In other words, law enforcement won't help, education and counterspeech won't help. Then, as a last resort, you may punish the speech. So a good example is a true threat. And the law uses the term true threat because in everyday speech we use the term threatening rather loosely. No, it can't be loose, but if the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear that harm will come to the person at whom the speech is targeted, then it may be punished. Sadly, hate speech does often occur in contexts that constitute true threats, or to give other examples of speech that satisfies the emergency principle, that intentionally incites imminent violence that is likely to happen imminently, that constitutes targeted, direct harassment or bullying, then the speech can be suppressed. So in other words, when it actually threatens the most harm, it is already punishable. But when it's only that the idea is offensive, then it has to be protected. Okay, very quickly, because I have less than 5 minutes left now. In terms of other countries' experience, there is no correlation between the countries that strictly enforce hate speech laws and those that have made progress in stemming discrimination or violence. And there's been great disenchantment in those other countries with how these laws have not worked. To give an example, Germany has some of the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the world. And yet, as those of you who follow the German political system know, Germany has had, epic outbreaks of discriminatory violence against immigrants and certain ethnic minorities. In the last national elections in Germany last November, an explicitly racist party got almost 13% of the vote. France, we know about the horrific anti-Semitism that's driving so many Jews out of France, even though France has some of the strongest laws that even define and criminally punish even criticism of particular policies adopted by the state of Israel can be criminally punished as hate speech. So that leads to another problem with these laws, is that here those who advocate punishing hate speech, to the best of my knowledge, always want to confine the laws to punishing targeted face-to-face insults. But when you look at how the laws have been actually enforced in other countries, they are constantly enforced against expression of ideas in the political debate, including ideas about crucial public policy issues such as immigration policies and policies about racial justice. I think since I've mentioned the Nazi history in my own family and the kind of very historic ACLU case with the Nazis in Skokie, and more recently defending free speech rights for neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, Virginia, many people think that, if only the Weimar Republic, in which Hitler came to power, if only they had suppressed hate speech, we could have stopped the slaughter of millions. In fact, the Weimar Republic did very strictly enforce anti-hate speech laws that are very similar to the laws that are still in place in Germany. And many of the leading Nazis were convicted, and they welcomed those prosecutions and convictions for the same reason that provocateurs today welcome attempts to suppress them, and that was the strategy of the neo-Nazis, both in Skokie and in Charlottesville, to gain attention, which leads to sympathy. They can posture themselves to be free speech martyrs. What the real tragedy in Nazi Germany, or the Weimar Republic, was the failure to punish actual violence that was committed by the Nazis, so assaults and even murders of their political opponents and of Jews and other minorities. It would be as if the United States had made no effort to punish those who assassinated Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. And again, our efforts were not always as successful or concerted as we would have wished, but those kinds of efforts were completely absent in Nazi Germany. I think, do I have time to make one other point? I saw a 5-minute, but I don't know how many are left. So one other point. The reason why hate speech laws in practice are disproportionately used against speech that advocates changing the status quo, that advocates the rights of minority groups, political dissidents, actually follows from the very premises of those who advocate these laws. It's not just an accident. It flows from the very reasons why we are tempted to pass those laws, and that is that we still have enormous racial and other kinds of discrimination in this country of a structural and systemic type. I believe this based on studies that have been done of the criminal justice system and of the civil justice system. We also are not immune at an individual level from unconscious or implicit bias. How could we be in a society and a culture that has such entrenched racism and other kinds of discrimination? So I accept that diagnosis of the problem, but for that very reason, I reject the proposed solution of giving to government officials a power that is inherently irreducibly subjective and discretionary. To define what to decide, what speech should be deemed to be hateful and hated and to be suppressed, of course the powers that be are not going to wield that subjective discretionary power in a way that is friendly to opponents of the status quo, those who are in the minority in terms of political power or their social identity. And I can quote, as I say in my book, many minority group leaders who make that point over and over again. But since I am at the end of my opening remarks, I would like to conclude those by coming back to the affirmative part of my message, because just as I believe very strongly that we should all oppose censorship, I believe especially those of us who oppose censorship have an especially strong moral responsibility to do everything we can through our powers of free speech and organizing and advocating and educating to oppose hatred and discrimination. So I'd like to end by quoting my favorite ACLU t-shirt, which reminds us of a right that isn't nearly as well known as one that we hear about a lot. You have the right to remain silent. This one says, you have the right not to remain silent. Please exercise it vigorously. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. We will now be opening it up to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and either Wesley or I will come and hand you the mic.
All right, hi, thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask whether you think the internet poses any unique challenges, and I'm thinking particularly of online communities built around what I think most everybody in this room would consider hateful views.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me your name? I mean, just everybody who asks the question,
Yeah,
if you don't mind.
my name's Bruno, as in Bruno Mars.
Bruno, great question. You know, I'm a typical law professor, so I'm so tempted to say, because I'm really interested in your views, and you obviously have views, or you wouldn't ask the question, so maybe we can have another opportunity to exchange views. But the internet, like every medium of communication, can be used for good or for ill. So there is absolutely no doubt that it is easier to transmit hateful messages on the internet, but guess what? It's also easier to transmit counterspeech. And one of the very interesting things about the internet is that it also makes it easier to study the effectiveness of counterspeech and to analyze what strategies we can use to make that counterspeech maximally effective. And I certainly have a lot of quarrels, which I describe in the book, with how some of the social media and other online intermediary and very powerful companies have been exercising their power in ways that I think are undesirable. But in fairness, some of the positive that are coming from Facebook, Google, Twitter, among others, is that they have undertaken very serious initiatives to document how counterspeech works, and in enlisting academic and other experts. And the findings are fascinating. To me, they're incredibly encouraging. There are very powerful examples, even of people who specifically go online to do exactly what Bruno says, to try to recruit other hate mongers to their fold, who have in fact been recruited away through persistent engagement with others who have different views. And one of the lessons that emerges, and it accords with common sense, a lot of social science does, validates common sense, or vice versa, that it is not a particularly effective vehicle for trying to dissuade a hate monger or would-be hate monger by calling them a racist and by calling for them to be punished or by calling for them to be silenced. But what does work, humor is very important, compassion and empathy are incredibly important, and patience. It takes a lot of back and forthing. So I think that while there's a lot of potential downside, there's a lot of potential upside, and I'm very happy that the companies themselves are exploring those.
Hi, my name's Elaine, and that is a very loud mic. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for your speech. I have a question about who bears the responsibility and who bears the burden of combating this free speech. I wonder if government intervention is not the way to counteract hate speech. I wonder if the burden tends to fall on the people who the hate speech is directed against, specifically people of marginalized identities, minorities, etc. And as an Asian American woman myself, who also has a ton of privilege being at this high educational opportunity, etc., I just wonder, will the burden continue to fall consistently upon people of marginalized identities, and will we ever not carry this burden?
There should definitely not be a burden on people who are subject to hate speech themselves, and I hope I made that very clear, that I think it's wonderful if they do feel sufficiently empowered to speak up against the hate mongers, but I think it's the entire society, certainly the government leaders, and on campus, the campus leaders, who have that responsibility. And no matter who we are, and no matter who is targeted, we as human beings who are committed to equality and diversity have that responsibility. But I also think, and again, one of the people that I quote a lot is Barack Obama, because this was a major theme for him, especially in the last couple of years of his presidency. And he's an expert, right? He was subject to all kinds of vitriolic hate speech and saw it targeted at his young daughters too, which must have been especially painful. And in his last year as president, in his commencement addresses, including at Howard University, he kept raising this theme, and not only telling minority students specifically that they should not engage or advocate censorship, but that they had to steel themselves and train themselves to grapple with the speech and to speak up for themselves. He was not saying you have a legal duty to do that, but he was saying you have a duty to yourself as an individual and to your community. I'm not going to waste the time to read you the quotes. I can't possibly do him justice. He's so eloquent, but I'm paraphrasing it. And he said, yes, I do recognize that this does put an extra burden on minority students, but in the end, it is going to benefit them because it will make them empowered. It will give them practice as their college students for dealing with the inevitable hateful speech that they're going to find when they graduate from college. And somebody else who said this very, very eloquently was Van Jones, who's apparently a very popular political commentator and leader, liberal. And again, he said it very eloquently, but he said to college students, I don't want you to feel safe. I don't want you to feel comfortable. I want you to be insulted and outraged, because only then can you develop the energy and momentum for speaking back. You have to learn how to do that. Now, you can disagree. You look as if you might disagree. But again, this is part of the point that I made earlier. I would not feel comfortable making those points myself, but I'm so happy to see so many people that I respect. I quoted Ruth Simmons, an African-American woman, too, urging minority students to see the positive in speaking out for themselves, but definitely a burden that should be shared equally and probably disproportionately for those of us who are more empowered. There's a lot more I could say on that theme, but I see there are a lot of other hands up, so thank you for these.
Hi, I'm Grace. I like quite a bit of what you said, but to be honest, I'm really confused about how we got the fire ranking we did.
How we got the what? I'm so
the
sorry.
fire ranking, considering
okay.
there is a minority of students who think that the only reason we got it is because of the administration's draconian response to the Heather McDonald protest. This is in light of two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, we had a director of the QRC, the Queer Resource Center, who was hired and then promptly fired because of several tweets that he made critiquing white supremacy and heteronormativity. Secondly, CMC is the only one of the 5 Cs who, as of March 2nd, has not confirmed that they will not punish prospective students for peacefully protesting. So in light of these things, I don't know how we got that ranking, because it doesn't really seem to me like we deserve it.
Okay. Well, you raise a really good point, Grace. I can answer one factual question, but not another. FIRE is very clear that it gives the rankings on the basis, where did Grace go? Oh, hi. That it gives the rankings based on the written policies themselves, right? Not how they are enforced. That's a separate question. And it does acknowledge that there may be a disconnect between what the policy is in writing and how it's enforced. So in the March 21st press release, in which FIRE explained that this college had gained that ranking, it based it only on wording changes to a couple policies. One had to do with internet, and I can't remember, the other probably a student code of conduct. So the second factual issue you raised 2 incidents, and whether those were consistent or not consistent with various principles. I just don't know enough about I don't know anything about the facts, so I'm sorry I can't comment on that. And when you say to be honest, I hope you all feel that you can please be honest. I mean, I, of all people, can stand the slings and arrows of hurtful speech, so don't be afraid of hurting my feelings.
Over here.
So the issue of compelled...
Sure, tell me your name, please.
Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
So the issue of compelled speech is becoming a prominent debate in the U.S. So I'm wondering, in light of Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado, where you think the line is between upholding anti-discrimination laws and protecting the free speech of artists in public accommodations.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question, which depends on all the facts and circumstances of a particular case. So it's very hard to generalize, but that case presents 2 issues, each of which is involved in every First Amendment free speech case. On the one hand is the the activity that is being regulated sufficiently expressive that it even triggers First Amendment protection in the first place. And that's something that's been debated in many contexts, not only in this case, but nude dancing, burning the American flag, wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. I could give you many other examples. Basically, the Supreme Court has laid out a test that I think is very sensible in the abstract, but reasonable people can disagree as to whether it's satisfied in a particular case, including this case, where many people who support the same principles disagree as to how the principles apply. But again, it's common sense. The Supreme Court says any conduct will be deemed to come within the First Amendment protection if it satisfies 2 standards. Number 1, if the person engaging in that conduct intends to convey a specific message, and number 2, if that message is understood by the audience member. So, depending on the nature of the cake and the nature of the message, one can answer that yes or no. But even assuming that one answers that yes, you're still not going to win a free speech claim if the government can show that the reason for the regulation is of what, I'll use the legal term, of compelling importance, and that the regulation is necessary to promote that goal of compelling importance. Here, I think there's no doubt that the goal of preventing discrimination by those who are engaged in business, in the commercial sphere, preventing them from discriminating on the basis of the identity of their customers is of compelling importance. And we've gone through this already in the context of laws banning racial discrimination. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was immediately challenged by people who raised First Amendment defenses to having to be non-discriminatory against African Americans in their restaurant or in their hotel. And the Supreme Court basically said that the equal protection concerns outweigh whatever First Amendment concerns were on the other side. So those are the basic principles, but I won't go into the complexities in this case. I will say that my friends who are the top First Amendment lawyers in the country have split. You know, some of them have come out and have argued in favor of the cake shop, and some of them have argued in favor of the government. The one thing that they are unanimous on is that this case is very hard, that there are arguments on both sides, and that the particular facts are very important.
Hi, my name is Zach Wong. I'm a junior at CMC, and thank you so much for your talk. When confronted with hates or hateful speech, do you think that we not only have a personal duty or obligation to permit the action, but do you also believe there exists a personal duty or obligation to consider the ideas or receive the ideas with an open mind?
Can you clarify that? I'm really sorry, the second part of your question.
Sure. So are you primarily or only concerned with the simply allowing the act of hateful speech to be had, or are you also advocating that people considered like arguments with an open mind, especially when they consider them hateful?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to dictate what's going on in somebody's mind. If I understand your question, I apologize if I'm not quite getting it right. Then you can ask a follow-up. But I think you're saying, should we try to change people's minds, and should we also be open-minded ourselves, right? So should we engage in a dialogue okay, maybe this is what you're saying, because I was saying if you hear a hateful idea that you respond to it in different ways, maybe you try to rebut it, but maybe you should hear them out, give them an opportunity to engage with you, and I guess that's consistent with the strategy that has proven so successful in the examples I mentioned of engaging in a at least superficially respectful way with those who have hateful ideas, taking them seriously, treating them with compassion, engaging them in detail on the merits or the demerits of their ideas. Is that what you're asking? And let me also say, you know, I'm sort of free associating with different strategies because every situation can call for a different strategy. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does terrific work in monitoring hate groups and educating and how we can most effectively diffuse their strength, put out a brochure, a guidebook this summer, or that would be the summer of 2017, right before the college year started, because there are record attempts on the part of alt-right groups to recruit on college campuses. So the SPLC was trying to give guidance to college students of how do you most effectively diffuse the potential impact of these groups that are trying to recruit and do harm on your campus. And kind of counterintuitively, they argued that the most effective form of counterspeech in many situations is actually silence, in the sense of, you know, they said, we realize it is so tempting to be part of a counter-protest and to vigorously shout out and, you know, really strongly condemn the hate mongers' messages. And they said that may feel morally very satisfying, but in practice, it may well be counterproductive because it is giving them the airtime that they want, and you're just playing into their strategy if you do that. So they said maybe the best strategy in many situations is to just ignore them, and then their message won't have any impact at all. Or possibly you could have your own event somewhere far away in a completely different part of campus, but that's affirmative. That's not giving them the attention, but that is affirmatively celebrating diversity and equality and all the other values that you champion.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Bryn. This is about campus speakers. So over the past year on this campus, we've had a lot of conversations about whether there's a difference between not censoring speech and actively inviting speakers to campus, which might include paying them and otherwise giving them a platform. Do you see a difference between those two actions? And if so, what are the implications for free speech on campus?
Absolutely. The fact that that somebody has a right not to be censored on the basis of dislike of their disagreement with their opinion doesn't mean that they are entitled to any particular platform. By definition, university has only a finite capacity to invite speakers. This wonderful institution has a very large capacity with many speakers over many months, but it's still a finite number. And as long as the criteria that are used are pedagogically justifiable, right? Because you use the campus example. So one would assume that a speaker should be invited only if there is some educational benefit to be gained by the students from hearing that speaker. Now that said, maybe it would be pedagogically beneficial for a student to hear somebody whose ideas they strongly disagree with, and they may even think are repugnant, if that person happens to be very influential in the real world, and the larger world, I should say. This is a very real world. And I think of that criterion because there was an incident debate at the University of Chicago recently where a professor at the business school invited Steve Bannon for a debate, and there was a lot of pushback from alums of the University of Chicago and faculty members there, arguing that it was a complete waste of resources and it was legitimizing messages and ideas that they hated. And my view is, for better or worse, this guy is extremely influential. And I'm not saying that I necessarily would have decided to bring him to campus myself, but I totally can understand the pedagogical benefit of giving students an opportunity to hear him out and to formulate their own responses to his ideas. Somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos I put in a very different category because while he certainly has a following, I guess, out there somewhere, he's not in positions of governmental power. He's not affecting public policy, and I think a good argument can be made that we're simply giving him the opportunity to be insulting and that there's not particularly educational benefit there. Now, I'm not saying these judgments are written in stone, but I'm saying these are the kinds of considerations that we should weigh. Is there some educational benefit to the students? And the educational benefit is separate from, do we approve of the ideas that the speaker is uttering?
Hi, my name is Lale. Thank you for your talk. So this question is kind of a follow-up to your response to Elaine's question. And I'd just like to say that I do agree with you in the sense that you have to be somewhat uncomfortable in order to learn, right? Your education's not meant to just agree with the viewpoints you already hold. They should be challenged. But I do think there's a big difference between someone respectfully challenging your ideological views and someone somewhat dehumanizing you, challenging your right to go to this institution or be in this country and things like that. And I'm wondering if you think that the burden that's placed on you or anyone else to respond to that sort of thing, or the obligation, is still beneficial to your education, or doesn't that discomfort in some way take away from your education?
Discomfort actually can have a positive psychological value. I'm not a psychological expert, but I have read those who are, including Jonathan Haidt, who I understand spoke here recently and has a new book coming out in which he expands on it, on this idea and cites many other cognitive psychologists and mental health experts who argue that there can actually be a benefit to students from confronting insulting ideas and epithets, and they can be trained how to respond to them in ways that develop their resilience. It's part of a broader pattern that there are psychologists say that there are two kinds of stress, one that is very harmful to our psyches and can even have adverse physical manifestations, physiological manifestations, and others that are actually good for developing our ability to deal with stress in the future, and that all of us can be trained, and they contend should be trained to learn how to make it into a potentially positive growth experience rather than a negative one. And I've observed this in particular individuals, and so what I find so inspiring is that when you look at surveys of college students in terms of the hateful incidents on their campuses, a big study was just released by BuzzFeed at the end of last year, and they said it was the first major study that had been done since the election in 2016 where there is a documented increase in reported incidents of hate speech and hateful crimes. They did a huge survey of college students, and what was really remarkable was that the students felt that their campuses had responded positively. That they said the presidents in almost every case had spoken out strongly against the hate speech so that there was no burden that was put on the students who were disparaged themselves, but that resources and training and support were given to those students so that they didn't have to view themselves as victims or survivors, but could view themselves as people whose dignity was not allowed to be touched by those people, that they could look down on those people who insulted them rather than let the insulters make them feel that they were being denied their human dignity. So I really believe that it is something that all of us can learn and develop our abilities to rise above those who are trying to deny our humanity. Maybe we can't persuade them that they are wrong, but they certainly should not be allowed to persuade us that we are demeaned by their discriminatory ideas.
Hi, my name's Dylan. Thank you for speaking to us. The lack of a consensus on what is true and the rise of fake news seems to me to make it harder for counterspeech to effectively combat hate speech. So I'm wondering if you think there needs to be some way not to necessarily censor what is false, but to definitively determine truth and fact versus untruth.
Do you think that can be done? Okay, a rhetorical question. Is there a way to definitively sort the truth from the falsity? I strongly doubt that. And, these are tough questions, and sometimes I like to think of it this way. What is the least bad option, or whom do I distrust more? So today, I just happened to read an article today. I was mentioning to another group of students, a European press organization was doing a very critical article about a number of countries now have passed laws criminalizing fake news. And these laws have to have definitions, but the definitions are inevitably vague, right? One person's hyperbole or exaggeration or, one factual inaccuracy can be somebody else's fake news and dangerous news. And not surprisingly, these other countries are using those laws exactly the way we would predict, exactly the way hate speech laws have been used. So there is definitely a similarity there, an overlap, Dylan. And that is to punish whatever ideas they dislike. Look at the President of the United States. What does he denounce as fake news? It's any news that is critical of him. So I would say, what is the greater danger in trusting government officials who are responsible to and accountable to the majority, those who wield majoritarian power? Do we want to trust them to make these sometimes delicate decisions of the true from the false, or the sufficiently false, because all of us engage in some inaccuracies, right? That it's sufficiently false that the government should punish it? Would we rather trust Trump at the federal level and governors and mayors and so forth, university officials? Or would we rather trust our fellow citizens, our fellow members of our community? It's a tough choice, but for me as a civil libertarian, I guess I'm always going, especially defending rights of minority ideas and viewpoints, and those who are members of minority and disempowered and marginalized groups. And I say that because those are the ones whose civil liberties, by definition, need protection, right? If you're in the majority in any way, you've got elected officials are going to be responsive to you. And so I distrust the government more than I distrust the not perfect judgment of my fellow citizens.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have this evening. Please join me in one more time thanking Nadine Strossen.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.